Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show that's all about the translation of Bloodborne. We're going to start things off this time picking up right where we left off, with one final observation on the translation of Adella's lines from the previous episode. Basically, I'm impressed with the flexibility employed in the translation of certain set phrases in the Japanese. You may have noticed that my literal translation featured Adella addressing our character as Good Hunter, just like the doll. That's because the Japanese term, Karyudo-sama, is the same. Yet here the English used is Brave Hunter, as opposed to Good Hunter, which I think emphasizes the way in which Adella thinks highly of us, having saved her from being kidnapped, as opposed to the doll's reasons for speaking to us with polite language. Also, when Adella offers us her own lowly blood, the Japanese phrase used is Chi no hodokoshi, or blood ministration. Yet the choice not to employ that particular term in Adella's spoken dialogue, I think makes her sound more natural and helps to establish a parallel between Adella's offering us her blood and Arianna offering us hers. And on that note, consider this.
I'll spare you one nugget of advice. Beware the Lady of the Night. I can see it in her eyes. She deeply resents the young saint. She hears people whisper. She knows what people think of her. Yes. She despises the saint for having what she doesn't. Bloody wench, they should have moved her on ages ago.
You really don't like Arianna, do you?
Give it a rest, please. I've no time for your petty lies. And what, just go away now. I can't stand the stench of your lying breath.
So, among other things, setting up a parallel between Arianna and Adella and then comparing and contrasting them does seem to be important in the context of the game. As a result, making a choice to potentially encourage that connection instead of having Adella use the specific phrase blood ministration seems like a reasonable trade-off to me. But now that we've gotten some more dialogue from that narrow-minded individual, let's go ahead and focus on that set of translations. Here I think there's one underlying change that can explain many of the individual differences between his official dialogue and my own more literal translations. To put it simply, the character seems to be notably less misogynistic in the official translations. This isn't the first time we've seen this trend in the game either. After this character overhears us telling Arianna about a safe place, he makes a derogatory comment about her that in the official English has been rendered, her sword's probably just fixin' to thieve some of your coin. But a more literal translation of the Japanese is something along the lines of, her brains must be as loose as her legs. Also, recall that in the lines of the blind beggar who lives in the chapel, in the Japanese he seems to associate Arianna's kindness with her being a woman, whereas in the official English that isn't really the case. Taken together with the line we just heard about Arianna despising the young saint for having what she doesn't, that more literally translates to a remark on how frightening a woman's jealousy can be, and I think it's possible to see a pattern here of translation choices that move away from sexist statements. I have to say in general I'm in favor of these types of translation choices, but it does touch on the ever-controversial subject of censorship in localizations, a subject that's always difficult to discuss, especially where different cultural sensibilities are at play. As we've already seen with visual symbols for temples on Japanese maps, for instance, what can come across with one effect in one culture can produce a very different effect in another. But now that we're here, I'm curious, is this person still having a wonderful night?
A night of curses. A night to remember. Wouldn't you say, friend?
Judging by that unchanged dialogue, I would say so. To get back to the point I was making though, sometimes not making any changes to a more direct translation in the localization process can result in a greater discrepancy in how a work is perceived than if changes had been made. Some of my favorite examples of this actually come from certain Japanese beverages. For instance, who wouldn't want to drink some delicious Pocari Sweat? Or try a refreshing bottle of Calpis? Of course, the interesting thing about Calpis is the issue lies more with a mishearing of the name than the name itself. But the point is, sometimes things that have one effect on a Japanese speaker can have a very different effect on an English speaker. And in this case, we might be looking at a difference in how a particular NPC is being perceived. I've said in an earlier video that in English I mostly find the character of the narrow-minded man to be that of a humorous contrarian, someone who's unpleasant but ultimately comes across as funny. My impression of the character based on his Japanese lines, though, is considerably different. There's nothing funny about him, he just strikes me as a miserable person. So the question then becomes, what was the intention for this character? How much is he supposed to put players off, and how much is he being played as a kind of laughable curmudgeon? If the character was meant to come across as the latter, then I'd say these have been some very successful changes. If not, though, we're left with an interesting case where some translation choices could be contributing to an altered perception of a character. Honestly, there's a lot more you could say on this and related subjects, but for now let's check in on someone else.
Oh, hello. The whole town's turned, has it? Quite a big family now, aren't we? Though, I'm afraid I seem to be the black sheep. Back for my blood, I presume?
Actually, not right now.
Oh, that's a pity. Anytime you're ready.
You know, maybe it wouldn't hurt.
Oh, hello. The whole town's turned, has it? Quite a big family now, aren't we? Though, I'm afraid I seem to be the black sheep. Back for my blood, I presume?
That's right. Except, I guess I can't take any more. It just so happens that the dichotomy between Arianna's blood and Adella's blood is mechanical as well. You can't receive a blood treatment from one while you have a vial of the other's blood in your inventory. But let's focus in on some of those new lines. There are two in particular that I find especially interesting. First, there's the line with the official translation of, "The whole town's turned, has it?" I've provided the more literal translation of, "It's dangerous everywhere in town now, isn't it?" But there is one aspect of the Japanese that doesn't necessarily come through all that well in either version, because Arianna starts out by using a common enough phrase in Japanese, yappari. I've talked about this term before. Like I said, it tends to get used a lot, and it's sometimes given the translation of "as expected." Generally, the phrase indicates that a given outcome is unsurprising to the speaker, or that a given situation is the same as before. So here, Arianna is saying that, as she feared, the whole town is unsafe. The question then becomes, unsafe in what way? And here I think is where we can see some of the logic followed by the official translation. Consider the state of the people we've checked in on so far. Some of them seem unchanged, but others have been reduced to simply making odd noises or screams. Also, keep in mind what we've learned from Jura and witnessed with Vicar Amelia. People here are turning into beasts. In other words, what threatens everyone in town seems to be the madness of the night and the threat of transformation. In light of that, it makes sense that Arianna might employ the phrase, "the whole town's turned." And hopefully her tone of voice and the addition of the phrase, "has it?" at the end makes it clear this wasn't an unexpected outcome for her. Finally, consider that this line has another, more subtle purpose to serve. It's one of a few different indicators that our player character has in fact saved everyone who can be saved. These need to be subtle though, because if they're too direct, one aspect of an NPC interaction that's going to come up later could be ruined. In terms of serving as a hint for those able to see it for what it is, while remaining vague enough so that others might miss or overlook it then, I think this phrase works out nicely. Which brings me to the second set of lines in Arianna's new dialogue that I wanted to bring up. There's one point where in the official translation, Arianna references the fact that with everyone gathered in Oedon Chapel, they've become quite the big family. In my more literal translation, she merely notes that the number of people gathered in the chapel has increased. Looked at individually then, this seems like nothing more than a change to a more natural way of expressing a similar idea. Instead, though, it turns out to be the setup for a graceful solution of how to naturally render into English the idea that Arianna is quite the despised one, kirawaremono in the Japanese. This term is unremarkable enough in the original language, but it sounds pretty awkward with a more literal translation. Here, though, because Arianna already used the metaphor of a family for the group in Oedon Chapel, she's able to refer to herself as the Black Sheep. I think this is a great solution, and a good example of how sometimes it pays not to work with terms and lines in isolation, but as whole passages to be taken together. That's enough about Arianna for the moment, though. We've got some more people locked in their homes out here to check in on. What do you think? Still willing to praise me?
Help me! Please help!
Oh, how can I help you? Hello?
Help me! Please help!
So that's all that particular character has to say, and as you can see, the translation is pretty straightforward. But what about this person?
My baby!
Well, that was disturbing, but at least I like the translation. So here's the thing about the English version of this line that some fans have picked up on already. This woman could either be addressing us, the hunter, or her own child. It's an ambiguity that I think works quite well in the English, and I was curious as to whether the same could be said of the original Japanese. As it turns out, it can indeed. You may have noticed that in my more literal version, the second of her line starts with the word so. This is to reflect the usage of the word dakara, which sounds a lot more natural in the Japanese than the word so does in English. It's a very common word in Japanese, and it's used to indicate that something said before is being used as a reason for what's about to be said. In other words, the woman is simply crying out about her cute or beloved child, then using that as a reason to tell someone not to get any closer, since no subject is indicated. She could be saying, "No, you're my cute little baby, please stay back." Or she could be saying, "My cute child is in here, so please stay away from us." The ambiguity is just the same. That the translation team was able to first pick up on the unclear nature of the original line and then deliberately recreate it in the English in a way that could sound natural regardless of interpretation, I think is a great example of a good translation choice. Really, I'm glad this is something the translation team picked up on in the first place, because I can easily imagine someone taking a look at that line and simply making an interpretation of who the subject must be. And I think most people's initial experience on hearing this same ambiguous line in English is probably a good example of how this could have been the case. Especially considering how common it is to have lines without any clearly specified subjects in Japanese, and thus how common it is to fill in those details, this line could have been utterly unremarkable. Instead, it's an example I think most people would point to as a nice touch. And on that high note, I think it's about time we ended the episode. Next time we'll have more dialogues to discuss, starting with the lonely old deer, but as always, if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for me, please don't hesitate to let me know. Thanks for watching, everyone.